watching Beyond Markets. Welcome. I'm Esther Awoni. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll continue our series of conversations around Nigeria's 2019 elections. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets, and you can send tweets to my Twitter handle too, at Esther O. Awoni. Nigeria's general election is scheduled to take place in February this year and will see the current president, Muhammadu Buhari, vie for a 4-year second term. Meanwhile, 61 political parties in the country have stated that the election guidelines unveiled by the Independent Electoral Commission contains clauses that violate the 1999 Constitution. Ronak Gopaldas, director at Signal Risk, joined me from Johannesburg to discuss the stakes in Nigeria's 2019 election.
This is the 6th election in Nigeria since the advent of democracy, and as is usually the case, it's going to be a very competitive, very tense and high-stakes affair. Elections in Nigeria, because of the zero-sum nature of the politics, tend to be events that generate a lot of anxiety amongst investors. They have the usual questions: is there going to be violence? What does it mean for the economy? And these kind of factors generate a lot of anxiety. I think it's no different this time. However, I do think that the two important factors and subtle differences that are framing this election. So number one is that the usual ethnic and geographic divisions that we see with the North-South divide and the Christian-Muslim divide are no longer as prominent because both candidates are Northern Muslims. And in addition to that, the 2015 precedent of a peaceful handover of power will make it very difficult for the loser of the election, if it's the incumbent, to resist that transition. So, those are two kind of subtle differences that I think investors should take note of. That said, I think it's still going to be a very, very interesting, tense and dynamic affair, which things are shifting almost daily in Nigeria at the moment.
Now, I'd like to hear your thoughts or perspective on this. Some analysts are saying that the 2019 elections will be a test of the robustness of Nigeria's democratic consolidation. Do you share that sentiment too?
I mean, it will definitely be a test. Can the country build on what was achieved in 2015? It's also going to be very, very competitive. I think if you just look at the candidates in question, President Buhari is a known entity, so is Atiku Abubakar, he's a veteran. There's the big point of departure for both candidates is around their approach to the economy. So if you look at Atiku, his stance is a reformer, market-friendly candidate. He's pledging to reform the NNPC, to liberalize the currency, new CBN governor. He's promising heaven and earth effectively to the business community, and he's marketing himself as a business-friendly candidate. His Achilles heel obviously will be allegations around corruption. And the fact that he's seen to be in some quarters as a very uninspiring candidate, a recycled candidate who was the former vice president and doesn't really offer much in terms of fresh change. With President Buhari, you know what you're getting. His economic ideology hasn't really changed much since the 80s. He's an interventionist kind of approach. That's his philosophy around the economy. He's strong on security and corruption, and he seemed to have more trust amongst the public in many parts of Nigeria. So, in crude terms, I was chatting to someone in Lagos, and what effectively they framed it as is, on the one hand, you've got a pro-business candidate versus a pro-poor candidate, and to take it a little bit further, you've got one candidate who seemed to be serious about corruption but is a bit economically aloof, whereas you've got a market-friendly candidate who's not serious about corruption. So that all makes for very interesting dynamics. And then if you combine that with the electoral maths, the regional outlook and voter turnout, that's going to really set the stage for a very intriguing battle.
Now, for Atiku, who, like you said, comes across as a market-friendly candidate, obviously that'll be good news for especially foreign investors, especially those who have been exposed to currency volatility. Obviously, this is something they want to hear. But when you look at Nigeria's historically, or perhaps at least from 2015, voting patterns, and the fact that most of the votes that we usually get come from the northern part of the country, and the fact that many of that does happen not even in urban areas. And of course, what is important to that or those categories of voters, obviously, perhaps to a large extent, different from what would be considered priorities for the other class of voters. Do you think that it could be a rather difficult one where, I mean, on the one hand, those in urban areas, in the middle class, for instance, the upper middle class wanting to have a more diversified economy, a more market-friendly economy, and not necessarily getting that from the incumbent. Do you think that this is just going to make the whole thing a lot more complex?
Yeah, the regional dynamics and the geopolitical zones and how much of the vote they account for are critical factors in this election. As we know, President Buhari is very strong in the northwest, and that comprises approximately 20% of the vote. But similarly, he's quite weak in the southern part of the country. The southeast and the south-south are historic PDP strongholds. But I think, you know, what is really going to determine the outcome of this election is the southwest, because that's the state or the geopolitical zone that's in play. I think, you know, traditionally the southwest has been very antagonistic towards the PDP, but Buhari is not very popular there either. So, you know, a lot of his antagonistic policies towards the business community will really have riled a lot of the folks amongst the investor community over there. But at the same time, he can count on support from his vice president, who's from Lagos, from Bola Tinubu as well. So, you know, that could work in his favor. I think what's going to be quite critical in the southwest is it's traditionally been a very apathetic region. So voter turnout has not been particularly good. If that does change, and if people come out in droves and they vote in favor of Atiku and the PDP for this very reason, the more business-friendly approach, then I think we could have a very close contest on our hands. But I think what is quite key in our minds at Signal Risk is that the Southwest is going to be critical if Atiku is going to win this election.
Now, for some of the issues, the critical issues that have been on the front burner that have taken up, have been part of national discourse since in the run-up to the elections, for example, the minimum wage, fight against corruption, insecurity. These are issues that I suppose are important to the generality of the Nigerian population. But for you, which would you say are the most burning issues, as it were? Corruption, the minimum wage, petrol, whether or not there will be petrol subsidy, and of course corruption, like I mentioned earlier. But what are your thoughts in terms of those key issues that could swing votes?
I think we can break this down into kind of two sections. So you've got the mega issues, which is the usual stuff, the security and corruption. That's the stuff that President Buhari won the election on in 2015. Then you've got the economy, which is his Achilles heel, and that track record is something that Atiku is really pouncing on and attacking the incumbent on his service record over there. The Nigerian economy has been in recession, youth unemployment has risen, and the regulatory environment has really taken a beating because of inconsistent and haphazard policies. So that's something that's really soured investor sentiment, and that's something that I think will work in the opposition candidate's favor. I think the other big issues that we need to bear in mind is the president's health. About 15% of his presidency was spent outside of the country being treated for health issues. How fit for office is he? There's still a big question mark around that. And then, of course, the issues around demography. Nigeria is a young country, and the candidates in question are 76 and 72 respectively. So there's a big generational divide over there, and there's a disconnect between those who are governing and those that they're governed, who are being governed. So how that tension is resolved is going to be interesting, particularly because youth and women are not adequately represented in the political dynamic as well. So I think to sum up on the macro issues, I think security, corruption, the economy, the health of the president, and demography are important. But on a more micro level, what I mentioned earlier, the electoral maths, the regional breakdown and voter turnout are going to be crucial on the day and in the run-up to the presidential poll.
Now let's talk briefly about the economy now. When this current government came in, of course, we were just coming out, we're still in a recession, and we're able to come out of a recession. Although we're seeing, we could see growth for 2018 somewhere around between 1.8 and 2%. Now, this current administration has been working off the back of its economic blueprint, the economic recovery and growth plan, but it's been met with several criticisms because 3 years later, the general consensus is that the economy hasn't been fully revived. The economy is not doing as well as it should. We're still having currency volatility, and of course, we're still exposed to the oil price shocks. So what are the conversations, or what are your thoughts in terms of how the other candidates, especially the main candidate, opposition candidate from the PDP, Atiku Abubakar, will be trying to sway votes, as it were, in terms of what his campaign promises are? I know he's talked about the fact that, he wants a more friendly business environment, but having listened to all of that, would you say that that is enough, could be enough to revive the economy?
So, I mean, Nigeria's challenges economically are well documented, right? It's not rocket science what needs to be done, but the low-hanging fruit is clear and consistent economic policy. And unfortunately, the Buhari regime has been haphazard and clumsy in the way that it's managed a number of key issues. It's seen to be ad hoc in terms of the way it's gone after foreign businesses. The MTN saga is a case in point. Now, we know that the economic approach of the incumbent is one of economic nationalism, of interventionism, and a heavy state hand. Now, the opposition candidate is offering the ideological antithesis of this. He's pledging the lowest corporate tax rates in Africa to encourage investment, privatization of the NNPC, which is a politically sensitive matter. It's from the current base that we're on, which is seen to be quite antagonistic towards business. I think the opposition candidate Atiku is really focusing on what business wants to hear. Now, there's a big difference between rhetoric and reality, and what's realistically possible in the current environment, is something that I think needs to be interrogated, because a lot of this stuff, according to a lot of commentators, sounds like pie in the sky. It's idealistic, it's aspirational, but it's not practical. I mean, you speak to people in Nigeria and amongst the investor community, and what arguably they anticipate with an Atiku presidency, if it materializes, a revival in animal spirits, a feel-good factor, potentially good for the oil sector and for the energy sector. But then, there are big question marks around his commitment and political will to tackle graft. And that's something that the APC will really attack him on in the build-up to the presidential poll on the 16th of February.
I've been speaking to Ronak Gopaldas, Director at Signal Risks. We'll take a short break and we'll be right back with the rest of the show. We're continuing our discussion on the stakes in Nigeria's forthcoming general election. Ronak Gopaldas, Director at Signal Risk, was our guest today. Ronak, let's pick up from where we left off. We're talking about the opposition candidate Atiku and the economic scenario that he paints. And you've said that, it's one thing to have that in theory. Of course, having a political will to pull that off is a different thing. But I would like us to just paint that scenario and Atiku's scenario and the kind of economy that he wants to build, market-based. Of course, he said that he's all for privatization and liberalizing the currency. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that obviously is good news for investors. Could you just, painting that scenario, what could change? What are those significant factors that could change if it does work, if we do see him coming in, hitting the ground running, and of course, liberalizing the currency and just creating that more business-friendly environment? What do you foresee?
So definitely animal spirits will be revived. There'll be a feel-good factor. There'll be an Atiku dividend potentially if these policies are implemented. But, there is a very real risk that the political setup and the horse trading and the change of government constrains the ability to do so. We saw that with the current government, where we waited 166 days for a finance minister. The key positions in the cabinet were not filled. So that policy inertia is a very real risk. And I don't think it's a given that the investor community is fully on board in supporting an Atiku win, because in many of the conversations that I've had, it's been a case of, do you stick with the suboptimal devil or do you hang your hat on the hope of change in the hope that it gives a timely boost to the economy? And I think investors and business people are split, because the overriding concern in Nigeria is we just want this election done and dusted. We don't want an inconclusive result, and we want to get on with things, because the current uncertainty is not good for business. So, a lot of people are now of the opinion, we know what Buhari is about. The second term can't be as bad as the first one from an economic perspective. There'll be more stability. We won't need to go through the disruption that comes with a change of government. And quite simply, they're not willing to risk what the potential upside is of an opposition win, because they've been disappointed from the last election. So, there's conflicting views around that. I think it's also going to be dependent on what type of victory either candidate gets. So, in the case of an Atiku Abubakar win, he's pledged that he'll only do a single term in office, which will create its own issues. If there's jockeying from the get-go, if he becomes president, that will undermine his ability to really execute on policy. It depends also on the composition of the Houses of Parliament. Will there be gridlock? So again, I think we need to be a bit circumspect around a lot of these pledges. But at the same token, the same is true for a Buhari win. What kind of win will that be? Will it be one where he gets a decisive mandate and his priorities around infrastructure, clamping down on corruption, tax reform, etc., are maintained? Or is it going to be one where it's inconclusive, he's plagued by health issues, and that creates a bit of uncertainty, so a kind of lame duck scenario? Or if he can't finish his term in office and the vice president takes over, is that a more market-friendly scenario? So the various permutations that are possible, and I think a lot of it is dependent on the nature of the win for either candidate. So all scenarios remain possible. As I've said, at Signal Risk, we give the incumbent the slight edge. But yeah, I think it's important just to temper expectations around what's realistically possible.
Now, Ronak, that being said, I know that you talk to investors all the time, and looking at both scenarios that you've painted, they're both come with their challenges. Know that on the one hand, investors want continuity and stability, but of course, there's also that temptation when one hears about liberalizing the currency, and of course being more market friendly, which is always good for especially foreign investors. But from your conversations and from what you're hearing on the streets, I know that this is probably a difficult question for you to answer, but what do you think, or what is your sense? What sense are you getting from what could give investors more comfort? Going with what they know, what they're already dealing with, or just taking that risk to try something new?
So I think either way, regardless of the outcome, what investors want is certainty. That's always the case, and what they don't want is a second round type of scenario. So regardless of who wins, they want this thing to be finalized as quickly as possible. I think that's probably a bit of an idealistic approach. We've seen the electoral playbook in many African states where the credibility of the Electoral Commission is challenged. The results are contested in courts, and of course in Nigeria you've got the added complication of the security dynamic and how that affects turnout. In addition, we can't dismiss the possibility of a postponement in the elections. So all of these kind of create some wildcard scenarios, which I think are problematic for investors because they again prolong the uncertainty. So as I've mentioned, in various conversations, investors are very split on their views. It depends who you talk to. So, it's very difficult to give a firm conclusion either way. I think both scenarios have their upsides and their downsides. But I think what's quite critical is that we get a transparent and credible process, because Nigeria is a key economic dynamo in Africa. The economy has a lot of potential, and at the moment the attitude amongst investors is very much a cautious approach, wait and see until we get clarity around the election, and that's obviously got implications for the growth dynamics, which will be a bit softer in the run-up to the poll.
Okay, let me ask you this. What are your thoughts on as they're being called now, the new kids on the block, if you will, those new political aspirants, especially coming from the private sector? We've seen a number of them garner a lot of support, and many of them, and we've spoken to a couple of them on this show, actually do believe that they have a very good shot, at the presidency. What are your thoughts on that? So
I think it's probably quite difficult to see any of the other candidates taking the presidency, just given the historical voting patterns and the electoral system in Nigeria. I think they could set the cat amongst the pigeons and split the votes from your traditional parties, the APC and the PDP. And I think increased political competition is certainly a factor that is good in the long run for the country's democracy. But I think realistically, I'd be very surprised to see anyone outside of President Buhari and Atiku Abubakar winning the presidency in Nigeria. But that said, you know, the political game and the nature of electoral politics in Africa is changing quickly. The likes of social media are changing the equation as well. And, you know, there are a lot of wildcard scenarios that are in play. It's very difficult to gauge public opinion in the current context. So, you know, I don't want to be dismissive, but I think the presidency will come from either Buhari or Atiku Abubakar.
Ronak, let's talk about the power of social media and how we saw that playing out in 2015. How do you see that playing out in this year's election in terms of citizens' involvement? We've heard of, citizens' eye report, as they're being called, and, you know, people taking pictures and just being ready to capture events at this year's elections.
Yeah, so social media obviously has positives and negatives. On the upside, you know, it leads to greater engagement, but in the current context of fake news and the likes, it can also be quite destructive. And we saw in the past couple of days Facebook coming out with a policy to restrict the amount of fake news in circulation. Social media is also something that polarizes opinions in many contexts, but at the same time, you know, greater citizen engagement, greater transparency, greater accountability. And we saw in the last two elections in Nigeria in 2011 and in 2015, it was used to great effect. So, you know, I think in the last election, you know, there was the anyone but Jonathan effect, which was used to great effect by the APC. So I think social media is definitely something that can work both ways. I think, you know, both candidates are doing their very best to harness the power of it in a way that's beneficial, but I think it's also by nature unpredictable. So, you know, it's definitely something that we need to be paying careful attention to. And it's very difficult for analysts, you know, to have an accurate gauge around opinion polls in the context of social media. We've seen it with the likes of Trump in the USA, Brexit in the UK, but we know that digital democracy is something that's on the rise in Africa and definitely worth paying attention to.
That was Ronak Gopaldas, Director at Signal Risks. That's our show for today. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch all previous episodes of the show on our website at cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets. And of course, you can send tweets to my Twitter handle too at Esther O. Awuni. For myself and the team, is bye for now.